Okay, hello everyone. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time out of your lives to come together for our annual meeting. My name is Arthur Ritchie. I'm here on behalf of my company, Berkins Ritchie & Associates, and this is your annual refresher training for the Drug-Free Safety Program. Now, as you may remember from past classes, or if it's your first time through, there's a couple of different reasons why companies choose to participate in the Drug-Free Safety Program. The first reason, quite honestly, are regulatory concerns that, depending on the industry that you work on, if you work in construction or manufacturing or oil and gas or any safety sensitive job, or any publicly funded job, that part of the bidding process with those jobs is that your company has to be able to demonstrate that you're in good standing with the state's database of drug-free employers. If you're not, then that renders your company ineligible to bid on those jobs, and that can impact your ability to go after those big game contracts. If those big checks stop coming in, then paychecks stop going out, and then all of a sudden the size of the workforce starts shrinking, and that's something we want to avoid. It's not the most important reason in the world, but it's pretty darn important. Beyond that, though, from my perspective, the most important reason why we do this is to keep the workplace safe. Actually, that's the most sacred obligation that any employer has. According to OSHA's General Duty Clause, employers are required to provide a safe work environment that's free from identified hazards that are causing or likely to cause serious injury or death. And unfortunately, one of the most common hazards that we're going to run into in the workplace are hazards that are posed by those folks that are working around us. Folks that are coming in an impaired state because they are under the influence of alcohol or some medication or some illicit drug. Sometimes the impairment is caused by fatigue or by illness or by injury or by emotional distress, or medication that they took, or medication that they failed to take. I mean, there's a ton of different things in cause. But bottom line, though, if the supervisor recognizes that a worker is not fit for duty or is too impaired to safely perform their duties, then they're required to pull that worker off the job before they endanger themselves or other people. And that's an obligation, which means it's a must, not a should. Now, there are two elements to fitness for duty, just on a very basic level, that when we report for duty and throughout the duration of our work day, as employees, we're required to be both sufficiently mentally alert, so we have to be focused and be able to have our head in the game while we're doing our job, and we have to have sufficient physical capacity to safely perform our duties. So we have to have mental acuity and physical capacity. Those two things are essential. And if for some reason we are not fit for duty, then again, the supervisors are trained to recognize indicators of impairment. They'll tap us on the shoulders, to pull us aside, give us a once-over. And again, it's important to remember this is something they're doing for us, not something they're doing to us. They want to make sure, just like everyone else, we want to make sure that all of our workers get home in one piece at the end of the day. And so this program is a collaborative effort between the employer and the Bureau of Workers' Compensation, the state-run insurance program for workers, to make sure that we're taking using all the knowledge that we've acquired over many years of doing this, to put the essential elements in place that if we suspect that somebody may not be impaired, that we can not only identify it, but address it, get that person some help, get them back to being the person they need to be, the worker they need to be, so that this can be a mutually beneficial relationship between the worker and the employer. Okay. Now, beyond that, there has been a ton of new information that's been released just in the last 12 months or so, certainly since the last time that I've visited with you. And so I want to share some of that information with you because a lot of it ties directly into the topic at hand. Some of these the dangers that are caused by folks that are under the influence of alcohol or other drugs, and then some mental health issues, and that's really right in the wheelhouse of some of things that we deal with the drug-free workplace. So I'll get into, there was a huge data mining operation that was a huge project that was undertaken by the federal government to try to determine what was going on where and how they could allocate their resources. I'll explain that in a moment. But before that, before I even get to that, I want to talk about a report that was released in February of this year, of 2020. And the Department of Health and Human Services released a report that said for the third consecutive year, beginning in 2017, that the life expectancy for Americans has regressed, has gone backwards. So that's incredibly alarming. Up until, from the time that we were born until 2016, we could reasonably expect as Americans that our life expectancy was going to increase every year. Sometimes it was very gradually, but the line always went in the same direction. Starting in 2017, it started going backwards. So it stopped progressing in 2016, 2017 went backwards, 2018 went backwards again, 2019 went backwards yet again. That's an alarming trend. And that's something that we need to keep an eye on. And there are some very specific causes for that. I don't have the time to go into all of them, but I want to concentrate on 3 specific studies that came out of that big research project that I mentioned a moment ago. And I hope that as I identify the issues, I'm not only going to give you the statistics and the data and the individual federal agencies that were responsible for releasing those reports, but I'll also give you some resources so that if you or someone that you care about is struggling with one of these issues, that you can expedite the process to get them some help, get that ball rolling, and hopefully intervene before it's too late. Now, that giant federal program or project that I was talking about, that research project, was conducted by the Department of Health and Human Services. And what they did is they looked at the National Vital Statistics Network, and they collected all of the death certificates from each county in every state, including in the District of Columbia as well. All 50 states and Washington, D.C. And they collected all the death certificates that were submitted between 1999 and 2017. And again, I can't even imagine what a massive undertaking that had to be. But they collected those death certificates and then they ran them through very sophisticated analytic software. And they extracted the causes of death and then a bunch of other demographic information. And then they sliced and diced that information to be able to determine where the federal government could allocate resources to try to address those specific issues head on where the help was needed the most. Right, does that make sense? Okay. And there were three areas of that research that, again, applied directly to what my staff and I do as EAP providers, as chemical dependency counselors. The first study that I want to share with you was released by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC. And just for your guidance or for your knowledge, I encourage you really to fact check everything that I'm sharing with you. I'll share the information in such a way that if you just want to take some brief notes with the source of the study, with some of the key findings, anybody can do a 5-second Google search and find the original source document. And each of these reports was written in such a way that a layperson should be able to understand it, and they're not real complicated. I know sometimes reading scientific research is like reading a foreign language, and that's not the case here. Those, even with somebody who's immersed in some of that, in some of those reports, it looks like gobbledygook even to me. So these are reports that are easily digestible and can be read in a sitting. The first study that I want to mention, I want to share with you, was again a study released by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And what they investigated was the number of opioid overdose deaths in the United States between 1999 and 2017. And in order to be able to do an apples to apples comparison with the number of people who died from opioid overdoses during those years, what they looked at was the number of opioid overdose deaths per 100,000 Americans. Right? Doing so allowed them to do an apples to apples comparison, regardless of population growth or contraction. If you're looking at deaths per 100,000, then you can look at equal values and see how things changed. And an opioid overdose death, it had to be listed as such on the death certificate by the coroner. And this is a death that was caused by a person ingesting such a large dose of an opioid drug, a painkiller, whether it's an FDA-approved drug like fentanyl or morphine or Oxycontin or Demerol or Dilaudid, or the street drugs like heroin or carfentanil. Either way, a pain blocker, and taking so much of it that it led to their imminent death. And the reason why biologically a person ingesting a large dose of an opiate drug will lead to their death is very simple. It's because as human beings and as mammals in general, we are pleasure-seeking, pain-avoiding creatures. That's how we're built. We have a survival system in our brain known as the limbic system. It's not particularly germane to this discussion, but that's what it's called. And this limbic system does a constant diagnostics of what's going on with our body and what needs and makes constant adjustments in real time to make sure that we can to give us the best chance of staying alive. And one of those systems that the brain keeps an eye on all day long, whether we're awake or whether we're asleep, is the amount of oxygen in our bloodstream. And when our oxygen level starts dropping too low, then our brain recognizes that because it creates a small twinge of pain, a twinge of discomfort within our body. It's so subtle that we don't even recognize it. But our brain does. Our brain picks it up, and it causes our diaphragm to contract. We suck in oxygen-rich air, and it goes into our lungs. We reoxygenate, the lungs reoxygenate our blood supply. And it's so subtle, and it happens so effortlessly that we don't even really pay attention to it. But a simple experiment that anybody can do to test this hypothesis is just hold your breath as long as you can. And you'll feel that discomfort. You can do that after the training if you have a moment. But that twinge of discomfort is essential to us staying alive because that's what causes us to draw that breath. So if a person ingests such a large dose of an opioid drug that it blocks that pain and we don't feel that twinge of discomfort, then the body doesn't know it needs to take a breath. The person stops breathing, their respiratory emergency leads to a cardiac arrest, and the person dies. And from the time of ingestion to the time of expiration, or the time of death, is really very, very brief. It's only about 10 minutes, give or take a minute or two, depending on the person. And that's without medical intervention. And I'll get into medical intervention in a moment. But you don't have very long from the time the person takes it to the time that they're beyond help. And what that report showed was that between 1999 and 2017, there was approximately a 492% increase in the number of opioid overdose deaths per 100,000 Americans. A 492% increase. It's unfathomable, really, that for most people, it's such an enormous number. It's almost like science fiction, but it's going on. This is what's happening in our country right now as we speak. And just as a baseline, if you don't do a lot with statistics, a 100% increase means that the number has doubled. A nearly 500% increase means it's increased by 5 times in less than 2 decades, which is again, just overwhelming. And what that means in real terms for like on the ground, for those of us who are fighting on the front lines of this battle, is that we're losing approximately 60,000 Americans a year to opioid overdose deaths. Again, a number that's so large that it just, for a lot of us, it just bounces off of our heads. But I want to just give you a quick example to help put things in perspective. If you've been to Progressive Field, if you've been to an Indians game since they've done the renovations and they've shrunk the capacity of the stadium a bit, then if you've been up to the stadium on a warm summer night, on a weekend, maybe when they're playing like the Yankees or the Red Sox, when the stadium is packed from the lower bowl all the way up to the rafters, then the capacity of that stadium is approximately 30,000 people. Now imagine every seat in that stadium, from the lower bowl up to the rafters, being filled with a dead body in every seat. Somebody's son, somebody's daughter. That gets you to 30,000. That's halfway there. It would take 2 nights of that to get to 60,000. And that's what we're losing every single year right now. And unfortunately, Ohio has been at the tip of the spear with this problem for nearly a decade. In 2016, 2017, 2018, Ohio was number 1 in the nation for opioid overdose deaths. Depending on how you slice the numbers, whether you looked at deaths per 100,000 residents or total number of deaths. But I can tell you that 11 of our 88 counties, at some point over the last 5 years, at least at one point, sometimes continually, have had to utilize refrigerated mobile FEMA trailers to serve as mobile morgues, because there were so many residents in those counties who died from overdoses that they had no place to store the extra bodies until the coroners were able to get through their backlog. Now, and for a large portion of that previous decade, there were large blocks of time when we were losing between 15 and 16 Ohioans a day. Now, in January of this year, in January of 2020, we did get some encouraging news from the Ohio Department of Health, and they said that on the headline on the Plain Dealer on January 14th, it said that it celebrated the fact that the number of confirmed opioid overdose deaths in Ohio had dropped beneath 4,000 for the first time in nearly a decade. That in 2019 we had 3,764 confirmed opioid overdose deaths. Now, those were the ones that were where there had been an autopsy done and the coroner was able to come to that scientific conclusion. Now, and I don't know if this is common knowledge or not, but I know for a fact that a lot of families, particularly when you have a person who's in their anywhere from 30 to 60, if a person dies from an overdose, a lot of times the families won't ask for an autopsy because they don't want that to be the final chapter in that person's life. They don't want the stigma attached to it. They don't want that to impact their life insurance payout or whatever. And so sometimes those numbers may be underreported. But I can't say for certain that those factors didn't contribute in previous years either. But we went from 15 or 16 deaths a day down to just over 11. Hopefully that's the beginning of a new trend. I'm very hopeful that's the case. Only time will tell. What I can tell you, though, is that there are a number of factors that have been identified as helping to contribute to that turnaround, or to the beginning of that trend, to the lowering of those numbers. The first factor that's been very important has been that there have been regulations put in place to stop doctors from overprescribing opioid medications. And so there was a time when doctors were actually incentivized to overprescribe, and please, let me be clear, most doctors, 99.9% of doctors are great people who went into the medical field to save lives and to help people and to improve the quality of life for folks. But there were a handful of folks who were bad actors, just like in any field. And they were willing to prostitute their prescribing privileges to become really little more than licensed drug dealers. And they were handing out these opioid drugs like Halloween candy. And when people started dying left or right, then the public officials the Ohio legislature took actions to crack down on doctors' ability to prescribe those medications. And they made it harder for folks who were already opioid dependent because of taking these medications for a long time. And that's really important for people to understand too. A lot of times people have this misperception of folks who become opioid dependent as being these ne'er-do-wells who are parasites on society, who are who have green mohawks and face tattoos and are living under bridges. Not like if you have face tattoos and a green mohawk that there's anything against that. I don't judge, but people have a lot this idea that there's these folks who just were living on the outskirts of society, and really it's much more likely that it's folks just like us who ended up becoming addicted because when folks got hurt and when they were injured or from playing sports or working on the job, and people are working longer than they used to work, and so if they have soft tissue damage or arthritis or other painful long-term pain conditions, a lot of times doctors were prescribing these medications, and we were taught to trust our doctors and just do what they said, and they didn't realize the danger. And so when those regulations were put in place and all of a sudden they didn't have access to the medications, then a lot of them turned to the streets for street drugs, and with really tragic consequences. Now, at the same time that those regulations were passed to make it harder for doctors to prescribe those medications, even for folks who truly needed them, it became glaringly aware that the legislature's concerted effort to really diminish the capacity of us to deal with mental health and recovery issues for the previous several decades had really come home to roost. It's kind of like you're cutting back the it's easy when you're in a boardroom to sit around and say, we need to cut the budget for the fire department, cut the budget for the fire department, cut the budget for the fire department year after year until there's a big fire. And then all of a sudden we say, oh man, what did we do? We could have really used those extra engines. We could have used those extra firemen. And this opiate epidemic was our country's big fire. And so we've suddenly had to play catch up. And Ohio has done a great job at that. And I can tell you that there's more resources available today to deal with these issues than there have ever been in our lifetime. Now, I mentioned earlier that without medical intervention, that death was likely in a very short period of time. When I'm talking about medical intervention, obviously I'm talking about the administration of medically assisted therapies, like the medication Narcan or naloxone. And both Governor Kasich, before him, and Governor DeWine now, have worked very diligently to make sure that medication is available to Ohioans who have a loved one who is opioid dependent, so that so they can go to a pharmacy without a prescription and just go to the pharmacist and say, I need to buy it and purchase 2 doses of it over the counter, so they can have it on hand just in case. So that if they come across their loved one who is unconscious and turning blue, that they can administer that medication and then start giving care while they're waiting for the emergency responders to get there. That can make the difference between the person surviving the event and not. There's also a ton of nonprofit organizations that are working to distribute this, and these are privately funded organizations. Project Dawn has been getting donations from private foundations and often from very wealthy families who have lost loved ones to this opiate epidemic. There's also another organization that I've become more familiar with, which I think it's important for us to be aware of. And if you have a Facebook account, if you have a Facebook page, then it's very easy. You can go to this organization's Facebook page and follow them, and then when they have announcements, they'll pop up in your feed. And the organization is called Harm Reduction Ohio. And it's funny that sometimes that these harm reduction organizations are viewed as controversial. But honestly, they have more reach and they have more access to do some things that even as counselors we can't do. But they have a very similar mission to what we have as counselors, because what their goal is to keep the individuals who are struggling alive long enough for them to make the decision that they don't want to continue to live that lifestyle and they want to make some healthy changes. That's exactly the same thing that we do as counselors. Generally, when people show up as self-referrals, or if they decide to come in through the workplace, they're coming in because things have gotten so bad that they are finally ready to make a change. And what these harm reduction organizations do is they go right out to the streets a lot of times, and they find people often at their worst point of their life, in the height of their addiction, and they start working with them to keep them alive, to keep them safe, and to move them gradually towards the ultimate goal of complete abstinence, just like we do as counselors. The difference with them is that, it's similar to the old joke about you don't have to be clean to jump in the shower, you go to the shower to get clean. And the same thing with these organizations or with counseling. You don't have to be clean to go to a counselor, you go to a counselor to get the help you need to get clean. It's a very similar situation. And so they do they distribute the Narcan at no cost a lot of times to these folks who couldn't afford it otherwise. And one other thing they do that is, and there's some other things they do that some people take umbrage with. I don't condone or condemn those practices. I understand what they're trying to do. They're trying to keep people alive, and it's hard not to support that. One thing that they do that I find to be particularly valuable is that they work very closely with first responders, with EMTs, with firefighters, with police officers, with emergency rooms. And they announce when there is a surge of overdoses in a particular community. And it was only a couple of months ago that it was in my community that there was a surge of overdoses. Approximately a dozen residents died. There were dozens more that were resuscitated using the medication-assisted therapy I just was talking about. But to a lot of people's surprise, the drug that was causing all these overdoses wasn't heroin. It was counterfeit Oxycontin tablets. And the counterfeiters have gotten so sophisticated with their techniques that they produce tablets that are virtually indistinguishable to the bare eye, with both the coloring, the texture, the paste even on the inside. That they're virtually indistinguishable from the FDA-approved pills that a person would get at a pharmacy. The Bureau of Crime Investigations even challenged pharmacists where they got pills from their evidence locker, and they mixed them in with FDA-approved pills. And they had pharmacists with gloved hands, obviously, go through them and try to pick out the fake pills from the real ones, and they couldn't consistently pick out the fake tablets. Well, I guarantee you, folks, if the pharmacist can't do it, what chance would any of us have? And the pills are so darn dangerous because people have a false sense of safety taking the pills because they think, well, what's the harm? I'm taking the same thing that my doctor would give is prescribed me anyway. I'm just getting them from my friend. And by the way, let me tell you something. Your drug dealer isn't your friend. They may be friendly towards you because they want your money. But if you stop using the drugs and you stop communicating with them after they've reached out a couple times and tried to get you to buy their stuff and you tell them you're not interested, guess what? Poof, they'll disappear. They don't care about you, they care about your money. And they don't care where their source is as long as they are able to sell their product. And a lot of these counterfeiters, what they're doing is substituting in fentanyl or carfentanil that they're getting shipped in from overseas to replace the oxycodone that would be in the Oxycontin tablets. They can't make money using oxycodone because that's not readily available. But these synthetic opioids like fentanyl and carfentanil that are being produced in these overseas labs, these clandestine labs where there's no oversight, there's no quality assurance, there's no regulation. What they're trying to do is make pills that are roughly the same potency as the pills they're used to taking. They try to create a roughly the same morphine equivalency. So if it's an 80 milligram tablet or a 60 milligram tablet, they try to put enough of the fentanyl or carfentanil in there so that they get roughly the same potency. But they don't know what they're getting from these labs. The labs don't know what they're putting out. And so they may use exactly the same formula that they've used in the past and put out and create these pills that are 5, 10, 20 times as potent as what they are trying to achieve. And so when a person takes the same dose that they would normally take, or at least they think they are, they're getting a dose that's actually 10, 20 times enough that can be enough to stop them from breathing, stop their heart, and end their life. I'm not saying this to be alarmist. I'm not saying this as a scare tactic. I'm telling you this because we've lost clients in our practice. I've talked to the families of folks who have lost these individuals who got a counterfeit pill. So I'm telling you this because just so you know, there is no safe way to buy these pills on the black market. And every day that a person is using and getting those pills from unknown origins, they're playing Russian roulette. And you never know when the last dose is truly going to be their last dose. So every county in Ohio now offers their own no refusal detoxification programs, either in their own county or they partner with a neighboring county. So all you have to do is Google your county name, the word opioid, and help. And the state of Ohio has pages for that county, and it'll walk you through precisely what emergency room you need to go to. You go to the emergency room, tell them that you're there because you have an opioid dependency issue, you need help. They'll take you into a private consultation room, ask you a couple of questions, and then they will take you right up into a waiting bed and start the process for you. It's never going to get easier. It always gets harder. The real challenge is just taking the step. Bite the bullet, jump out of the plane, pull the chute. Get your life back. Because as long as you're addicted to this stuff, it's like you're walking around in prison, and it just drains everything from you until it'll eventually take your life. I hope you'll pass this information along if someone in your life is dealing with this issue. The second study that I want to share with you was released by the National Institute of Health. And this study looked at alcohol-related deaths in the United States between 1999 and 2017. And just as a disclaimer, I want to be very clear about this starting off. I'm not sharing this information with you as a prohibitionist. I'm not interested in taking away anybody's alcohol. I don't want to take away your glass of wine with dinner, or your cold beer with your steak, or your Jack and Coke on a Friday night, or your champagne toast at your wedding, or anything else. I assure you. I just want to share the findings. I know I'm telling you that because sometimes when you talk about something that a person is too close to, they shut down. They don't want to hear it. And I really hope you'll listen to what I have to say. The National Institute of Health shared this study, looked at alcohol-related deaths, and these were deaths that on the death certificate were determined to have been caused by either the acute, meaning the immediate, or the chronic, meaning the long-term misuse of ethyl alcohol. And ethyl alcohol is the active ingredient in the booze that many of us consume. Now, the reason why ethyl alcohol is such a dangerous drug, and by the way, between 1999 and 2017, the number of deaths per 100,000 during that 18-year period of time more than doubled, which is, again, crazy. It disproportionately affected women. There was a 35% increase of alcohol-related deaths among men. There was an 85% increase of alcohol-related deaths among women. And that's because the alcohol industry specifically targeted women to get them to drink more, because market research showed them that women were lagging behind. And so they started making sure that, like fine-tuning their messaging to make sure that it was getting to women. I'll get into that more if I have time in a moment. But the reason why alcohol is such a powerful, dangerous, potentially deadly drug is because of the type of drug that it is. Ethyl alcohol is classified as an anesthetic drug. Now, anesthetic drugs work on their body by putting brain tissue to sleep. They put brain tissue to sleep temporarily, sometimes permanently, but they put it to sleep just like any other anesthetic drug. And there was a time in our history where ethyl alcohol was the primary anesthetic drug that was used during medical procedures. Now, since then, we've come up with much more effective medications. But regardless of what anesthetic drug you're using, if you're going into the hospital for a procedure where you require general anesthesia, what they're going to do is administer a anesthetic drug to you that's going to shut down your brain enough so that you don't feel and don't remember what the medical staff has to do to fix you up. And there's and again, alcohol was the most common anesthetic drug that was used in the United States for quite some time. Now, there are 4 specific phases of anesthesia that are very predictable that a person will go through. 4 different types of functions that will be affected and shut down by any anesthetic drug. So I want to go through those 4 phases because that's important to this discussion. Now, the first phase, the first group of functions that are affected will be your cognitive functions, your thought processes, your logic, your reasoning, your decision making, your fear of consequences, your inhibitions, your common sense. That's why, when a person starts getting drunk, the first thing that goes out their window is their give-a-darns, because as human beings, we're notoriously poor judges of how impaired we are when we're impaired. We don't realize it, and then we make terrible decisions. Don't believe me, go hang around a bar at last call, and you'll see a whole bunch of people making terrible decisions with their cognitive functions knocked out. The second phase of impairment of anesthesia will affect your motor functions, your balance, your coordination, your body movements. And that's why when a person starts getting drunk, and you see them get progressively more drunk, they start staggering and tripping and fumbling around, dropping things, or if a drunk driver gets pulled over, the officer will ask them to step out of their vehicle and do the field sobriety test, because those law enforcement officers understand that if that person has consumed enough of that anesthetic drug to get to the point where they're affecting their motor functions, they're too impaired to be behind the wheel of that car. The
The third phase of anesthesia are your sensory functions. And that's really the sweet spot for medical anesthesia. That's the target where the medical staff wants to get you to a point where you don't feel the pain associated with what they have to do to save your life or fix you up. If they have to cut you open or saw, use a saw or drill or or sew you up or whatever, they don't want you to feel it. They don't want you to remember it. They don't want you to see, to hear, to smell, to taste, to remember. That's the sweet spot. They want to get to that third phase and stop you right there before you get to the fourth and final phase of anesthesia, which are your vital functions. And that's going to be your lung function and your heartbeat. They want to get to the point where you don't feel what's going on, but they want to stop it before it gets to the point where you stop breathing and your heart stops. That's why if you go into the hospital and you go have a procedure where you have to undergo general anesthesia, they're going to, one of the two highest paid people in that operating room is likely going to be the anesthesiologist, because they are literally hovering you between life and death in that twilight zone. They're monitoring your vital signs. They're making sure that they're making adjustments to your medication so that you don't feel what's going on, but they don't stop your heart. Because if your heart stops, there's no guarantee they're going to be able to get it started again. It doesn't matter how good the surgeon is or how successful the surgery was. If they can't wake you up afterwards, it didn't do you any good. Now, some people die every single day in the United States. Often naive drinkers, people who are inexperienced, who drink so much alcohol so fast that they plummet right through those four phases, and they get to the point where they drink so much so fast they stop breathing, stops their heart, and they die. A lot of times young people have that happen to them, but that does happen every day in the United States. Many, many more people die from alcohol-related deaths that are caused by that first level of anesthesia, the cognitive functions, where the person gets so they have that first level of anesthesia. They make terribly ill-advised decisions, like they start getting drunk and they think that they can, they don't realize how impaired they are, and so they do terribly stupid things like getting behind the wheel of a car and driving. According to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, 1 in 3 highway fatalities is caused by an impaired motorist. 1 in 3. And they don't call them drunk driving accidents anymore, by the way. They call them drunk driving crashes. And that's because they realize that, even though the very end of that behavior may have been accidental, they may not have intended to go left of center, they may not have intended to hit the tree. They knew when they started drinking that they were putting a powerful drug into their body. They made the choice to do that, which then led them to the place where they ended up doing it, and that's why they changed the language. Some folks die in that first phase because they have Napoleonic complex, the little man syndrome. You got the little man with a big chip on his shoulder. Little timid Timmy who doesn't say 2 words to anybody during the day, but goes to the bar and gets a belly full of liquor, and all of a sudden thinks he's 10 feet tall and bulletproof. He's King Kong, wants to fight everybody. Somebody cracks a bottle over his head and he goes home and bleeds to death. That's an alcohol-related death. Worse yet, maybe the person goes home and is drunk and jealous and crazy and has some domestic violence incident that kills someone else. Maybe the person is on vacation and is drunk out of their mind, staying in some penthouse, with the balcony overlooking the main strip, and they decide they want to jump from one balcony to the next, and they miss their target and they fall to their death. Or maybe they're drunk as a skunk out in a boat, 100 yards off the shore of the lake, and they decide they don't want to be in the boat anymore, and they impulsively jump out and try to swim back to shore. They don't realize how cold or how choppy the water is. They go under. It's an alcohol-related death. And 3 out of 4 suicide deaths in the United States, 3 out of 4, according to the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, 3 out of 4 suicide deaths, the person has a blood alcohol level of 0.08, often considerably higher, at the time that they make the decision to end their life. 3 out of 4. I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, many more people die from alcohol-related causes because of chronic alcohol misuse. And by chronic, we're talking about long-term. Folks who drink so much, so often, for such a long period of time, that they do such severe damage to their internal organs that the damage is irreversible. And I'm talking primarily about damage to their liver, which is essential for the filtration of our blood. It takes the toxins out of our blood. And the liver is so resilient that based on recent medical advances, if a person has a proper tissue match, if, say for example, just for the sake of simplicity, you have an identical genetic twin, and one of you is in a terrible accident, and the liver is damaged beyond repair, surgeons can take half of the liver out of one twin and put it into the other, and both twins will have fully functional livers. It's amazing. And still, there are people who drink so much alcohol so frequently for so long that it does so much damage to that spongy, life-saving filter that spongy tissue is replaced with rigid scar tissue that can't filter anything. And they develop a condition called cirrhosis, and they die. Now, a lot of people who die from alcohol-related deaths don't have any alcohol in their system whatsoever. And that's just simply because they're the victims or the innocent bystanders. Maybe one of us that put in our 8-10 hours of work. We're driving home, feeling good about the job we did, looking forward to seeing our families. And some other individual who was sitting at a bar getting hammered all day is trying to fly home and get there before his significant other gets off of work and ends up going left to center, hitting us head on, and we never make it home to our family. That's an alcohol-related death. And the last thing I want to share with you is something that a lot of people may not be aware of, and it's something I probably should have shared with you in previous training sessions, but sometimes we're so close to something that we take it for granted that other people know, and they don't always. And I've become aware of that just in the last few months. A lot of people die every day in the United States because of alcohol withdrawal. Now, a lot of times, and again, they don't have any alcohol in their system at the time that they die, but it's still an alcohol-related death. A lot of times when people think about withdrawal, they think about opioid withdrawal. And I'll tell you what, if you've ever seen anybody go through opioid withdrawal, it is grotesque. It's gruesome. The person sweats and shakes and cramps and convulses and cries out in pain and begs for drugs and vomit and lose control of their bladder and their bowels. I mean, it is really, if you've ever seen it, it's unforgettable. It's haunting, really. And as a young counselor, I volunteered at a detox unit, and back then, in the many years ago, it was mostly individuals who were addicted to heroin that were going through that, and it was just tough to watch. It was a very awful experience for the person, but fortunately, the medications that were given to them, we did what we could to keep them comfortable. They didn't remember much of the experience, and when they came out on the other side, they weren't that much worse for the wear. It was a relatively non-lethal withdrawal, meaning that unless they had some other really serious complicating medical condition, once they got the opioids out of their system and they weren't going through the withdrawal anymore, they were pretty stable. Now it would take a while for their body chemistry, their brain chemistry in particular, to get back to where it was before they ever became dependent. But as far as them being physically stable, very few people die from opioid withdrawal, which I think is misunderstood a lot of times in popular culture. With alcohol withdrawal, it's completely the opposite of that. Lots and lots and lots of people die from alcohol withdrawal because of the type of drug that it is. Remember, alcohol is an anesthetic drug, which means it affects brain tissue, it affects brain chemistry, it affects electrical activity in the brain. And so if an individual has been bathing their brain in a powerful, dangerous, potentially deadly anesthetic drug day in, day out for years on end, and it doesn't have to be liquor, by the way. It doesn't have to be, vodka or bourbon or gin. It can be beer. It can be wine. A person who drinks 6, 8, 10 beers a day may never even seem drunk if they space them out. But their body is dependent on them. Make no doubt about it. And if the person has trained their body to expect that drug, and then they suddenly take it away, it's like having a house of blocks sitting on a rug and then pulling the rug out from underneath it. The disruption to the brain chemistry is so violent that it throws things completely out of whack, and the person they often has disruption to their electrical activity. And when there's that disruption to that electrical activity in the brain experiences seizure. And it's just like similar to like if a motor seizes, it locks up, it stops working. If the brain seizes, it locks up, it stops doing those diagnostics that are necessary for survival. The person stops breathing, the respiratory emergency leads to a cardiac arrest, and the person dies. And a lot of people, because this is a legal substance, they mistakenly believe that legality equals safety, which couldn't be anything further from the truth. And so they go home and they lock themselves in their bedroom and they try to they try to Johnny Cash it and just sweat it out and shake it out at home. And they don't tell anybody what's going on. They turn off their phones or whatever, and then they go through with delirium tremens. They experience that withdrawal. They stop breathing. They die, and then somebody goes by eventually and does a welfare check and finds them deceased. And there was nobody there to help them. I'm sharing this with you because it's really, really, really important that if you have someone in your life, in your family, someone that you care about, and you know that they are a heavy daily drinker, booze, wine, beer, doesn't matter. They're a heavy daily drinker, and then they suddenly are in a situation where they're not going to have access to alcohol. Maybe they're because they've been arrested, or they've been in an accident, they're in the hospital, or they've had surgery, or a heart attack, or they're in a nursing home. Then they may not be in a situation to be able to communicate that to the staff. And the staff doesn't know what the staff doesn't know. And so that falls on us to make sure that we don't let our pride get in the way, and that we communicate to that staff what we know about this person, that this person is a heavy drinker, and this person, so that they know to watch for the signs of withdrawal, and so that they can be prepared to get them the medical help that they need, and so that the person doesn't die in that secured setting. I know a lot of people have, shame and it's embarrassing or whatever, but at that point, remember, those medical professionals or those individuals in those situations are sworn to, they have to abide by HIPAA protections. They can't share the information with anybody. It's a one-way communication. You're communicating to them, they're communicating to the medical staff, and that's where it has to stay. You don't have to worry about it, about the stigma or about it getting out. And bottom line, nothing is more important than preserving the life of that individual. The last piece of this is, again, going back to that suicide statistic. 3 out of 4 suicide deaths in the United States, the person has a blood alcohol level of 0.08 or higher in their postmortem autopsy. The American Psychological Association, the APA, they studied suicide mortality during during the same period of time, that 1999 to 2017. They looked at suicide deaths per 100,000 Americans. And what they found was in that 18-year period of time, there was a 33% increase in the number of suicide deaths per 100,000 Americans. So what it had taken from 1776 to 1999 to get to, in less than 2 decades, it had increased by a third. Again, these are just astronomical statistics. And again, Ohio was right at the tip of the spear with this. You don't take my word for any of this. You can look at the statistics, but suicide now is the leading cause of death of young people between the ages of 10 and 14. It's the leading cause of death of young people between the ages of 10 and 14. It's the second leading cause of death of young people between the ages of 15 and 35. And Ohio has been so disproportionately impacted because the two demographic groups that have had the largest increases in suicides have been blue-collar workers and farmers, which might as well just say Ohio on it. Between 2007 and 2018, in just over a decade, there was a 45% increase in the number of suicide deaths among Ohioans. So in just over a decade, it increased by almost half. There were so many suicide deaths among young people in my hometown that Ohio flooded our schools, our middle schools and high schools, with mental health professionals to do seminars and offer counseling, and they conducted really sophisticated surveys with those students, where they asked the questions in a ton of different ways to make sure there was consistency among the answers, and they included validity questions to make sure that the person wasn't just going through and making random marks. They asked questions like, true or false, I regularly travel back and forth to the moon, or, true or false, my family regularly drives to France. So if the person, marked those as true, then, there was more than one invalid answer, then they threw out things. I was happily surprised to see that very few people provided invalid answers, because I think they took it very seriously because of it was their classmates that they were losing. These were kids they knew. And what they found when they went through the responses that they got and this was both public and private schools, they found that 5% of respondents, 1 in 20, admitted that they had made an active suicide attempt at least once in the last 12 months. 1 in 20. Not a whimsical daydream thought about, wow, maybe the world would be better off without me, or some self-pitying thought that any of us could have at any time, but they actually took action to attempt to end their life at least once in the last 12 months. And those were the kids that were able to be in class because they hadn't already completed a suicide. If that doesn't scare the hell out of you, I don't know what to tell you. So in closing, I just want to remind that a lot of people right now are feeling overwhelmed. A lot of people are feeling scared. A lot of people are feeling hopeless. I talk to people on a regular basis, not just clients, talk to people in social situations and other settings other than professional. I talk to young people who say they don't want to have children because they're afraid to bring them into this world because the world's so out of whack. I talk to people who say that they're working harder than they've ever worked and they're getting further behind than they've ever been. That they're just waiting for the other shoe to drop. They don't know how much longer they can go on. I mean, those are those are alarming conversations. And I want to tell you that as EAP counselors, as employee assistance program counselors, when you work with a network of other counselors, that each of us is required to operate within our field of specialization. So if someone calls us, any of us can talk to the person for an initial intake assessment. Once we identify what the presenting problem is, then we have to refer them to the specialist who deals with that particular type of issue. So if someone comes in with, say, legal issues, then we refer them to an attorney. Somebody comes in with addiction issues, we refer them to a chemical dependency counselor. Somebody comes in with severe mental health issues, we refer them to a psychiatrist or psychologist. Somebody comes in with grief or loss issues, they go to a grief counselor. Somebody comes in with marriage or family issues, they go to a marriage or family counselor, etc. And we have mile-high guardrails in place to make sure ethically that we don't cross over into somebody else's territory. Because our first order of business is to do no harm and to not give advice that we're not qualified to give. Not even make suggestions that we're not qualified to make. And so a lot of the folks, when we're dealing with them with drug and alcohol issues, a lot of the folks that get to us and because their alcohol consumption or their drug consumption has gotten so far out of hand that they need help to turn their life around. When we start digging into what's gotten them to that point, it's really heartbreaking how many of those individuals will disclose that they experienced just unspeakable trauma. There's again, going back to that foundational principle I talked about at the beginning of the session, that as human beings, we're pleasure-seeking, pain-avoiding creatures. It's not just physical pain we avoid emotional pain too. And when a person is hurting so bad, from depression or anxiety, sadness, fear, anger, resentment, rage, whatever, if they're stuck in those emotions, then a lot of times they'll try to dull that emotional pain with booze or drugs or medication or some other distracting behavior. And I don't think I ever deal with clients who have who've experienced more severe trauma, or very few to experience more severe trauma than folks who have lost a loved one to a suicide death. Because it's a very specific type of grief. The person has such conflicting feelings because the person who died by suicide was both the victim and the killer. And there's so many questions that are left unanswered. A lot of times the person feels guilty and they have survivor's guilt and remorse, and it's really complicated. There's actually a term for it called disenfranchised grief that's used to help people work through those feelings, because it's not like the person died from cancer or from a car crash. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff that you don't have the answers for. But I can tell you that when I talk to those folks who've lost someone, a child, a sibling, a mate, a parent to suicide, that during that conversation, one of two statements is very common. The first one is that they will say, if I had only known, I would have done anything to prevent it. The other statement is, I would give everything that I have in this world to bring the person back. But at that point, it's too late. What's done is done. So I just want to let you know that a lot of times when folks are struggling and feeling overwhelmed and hopeless, that darkness that crowds in on them is so overwhelming that it distorts their perceptions of other people's interactions with them. They misinterpret other people's behavior, and they come to believe that the people don't care, that they're disinterested, that they're self-absorbed, that they are preoccupied, that they're withdrawn. And a lot of times what they don't understand is the person who's withdrawing is withdrawing because they're so worried about them. They're not sure what to do. They don't want to do the wrong thing. And they, I just want to remind you that no one else is a mind reader. And I know that goes without saying, but it's important to remind us that no one else is a mind reader. And so if we need help, it's our responsibility to ask for it. I've been remarkably, happily, just unbelievably surprised by how willing people are to help once folks make it known that they need it. It's not just professionals or family members or friends. Often strangers come out of the woodwork to help people once we ask for it, but we have to ask. And once it's, and with so many people feeling overwhelmed right now, I know it can be paralyzing. I hear people tell me sometimes, I'm only one little person. I can't change the whole world. And I agree with that. None of us by ourselves can. But what we can change is the way that we choose to interact with the world. We can choose what attitude we're going to have. We can change the way we speak to people. We can change the way that we treat people. And if we make the decision to just be a little bit better version of ourselves, assuming that we're all amazing people, all of us have room for improvement. All of us can tweak the way that we interact a little bit, just to be a little bit better. And if we make that decision to just be a little bit kinder, a little bit more decent, a little bit more civil, a little bit slower to anger, a little bit more willing to understand, a little bit more willing to give each other the benefit of the doubt. If you see somebody who needs help, offer them a hand. If you see somebody who's hurting, offer them a hug. Outside of the workplace. If you see somebody who's drowning, don't step on their head, throw them a lifeline. Bottom line, if you can help them, help them. If you can hurt them, don't. Just don't be a jerk, And if we all commit to just being a little bit better versions of ourselves, we can start creating ripples of kindness and compassion and decency that can move through our homes, through our communities, through our schools, through our workplaces, and maybe we can start turning these numbers around. Because I guarantee you, there's not a single person watching this presentation right now who could have told me back in 1999 that things would get to the place where they are right now. But here we are. And I sure as heck don't want to look back 10 years from now and say, man, I thought things were bad back then. Look how bad they've gotten. But it's up to us. We have to make a decision. Are we going to be part of the problem, or are we going to be part of the solution? And I really hope that you all join me in making that decision to be part of the solution. I really want to thank you all for your time and your attention today. Please make sure that you have signed in on your sign-in sheets so you get credit for being here, so you don't have to watch the video again. And have a great rest of the day, folks. Take care.